Hello there, friends. It's Mr. Matt here with your Sunday school lesson for today. You'll remember we're talking about the parable of the lost sheep. And in that parable, which is a story that Jesus uses to teach us something about God or the kingdom of God. And in that story, we have a shepherd who has a flock of sheep. And as he is watching over them, he realizes that one of those sheep has gone missing. And so he goes and he takes the sheep to the sheepfold so that they'll be safe. But then he goes out and he goes in search of the one sheep that is missing. And eventually he finds that sheep and he brings it back to the sheepfold, and he celebrates and tells all of his friends that he found the one sheep that was lost. And isn't it a great day when the one sheep gets found and everybody and the whole flock is back together? Now, this week, I want to talk a little bit about the sheep. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever been lost? Have you ever been lost? I know that some of you probably haven't been. I know that maybe a few of you have. I can tell you about a time that I got lost when I was a boy. My mom had gone into a fabric store, and it was kind of a big store that had all of this material in it. And she was going around and she was looking for some fabric to make something. And it was kind of boring for me because I wasn't looking for fabric and they didn't really have anything that interested me in the store. So I just started wandering around and sort of following behind my mom. And she would go, and eventually I came to something that caught my attention, and I was just sort of playing with it. And then I saw something else that was interesting, and so I moved away a little bit and started looking at that. And meanwhile, I wasn't paying attention to where my mom was going, and she kept on moving and doing her shopping. And eventually I looked up and I didn't see my mom, and I didn't know exactly where I was compared to the last place that I saw her. And I panicked just a little bit. I started to get very worried because I felt very much alone. Now, luckily, we were all just in one big store, and eventually I just sort of stood where I was and I waited. And eventually my mom came and she found me, and she said, she asked why I wandered off. And then we continued shopping. But this time I stayed very close to my mom because I didn't want to get lost again. I think that's probably what happens with the sheep in our story. See, the sheep is probably out with all of the other sheep and is eating grass or drinking water and just sort of moving around as sheep do. And I think it probably saw a little tuft of grass that looked particularly good and wandered over there and started nibbling on it as the other sheep moved on. And instead of paying attention to the shepherd or the other sheep, just sort of said, oh, well, that grass over there looks good. Went over and had some of that and wandered in a little further as the rest of the flock moved away, until eventually the sheep was alone and started wandering around trying to figure out where the rest of the flock was and where the shepherd was. I think that tells us something that's very important for us to remember, since we are God's sheep in this story. We, God's people. It isn't usually the case where we decide and we say, I am going to go away from the shepherd, I'm going to leave God, and I'm going to go that way. That's not normally what happens to people. Usually, people get distracted from the shepherd. They get distracted from God, and they start with little small things like, oh, I'm just going to go over here. I'm not going to worry about going to church or something just this week or two. I'm going to go do that instead. And they just go a little bit away from God. But then that keeps repeating. And eventually, people and God find themselves very far apart. And it's not that God has gone anywhere. God has stayed, and God still wants us to be there. But we, the sheep, have wandered off. And in wandering off, we get stuck. And as we've talked about before, we get stuck in our sin, and we need the shepherd, we need God, to come and find us and rescue us and to bring us back to where we're supposed to be. Getting lost is not usually a decision that anyone makes. You make other choices until at one point you suddenly find you're lost and you're alone and you're missing God. You're missing the shepherd. So if we remember that about the sheep, and we remember that we, in this story, we are God's people, are the sheep, maybe that will help us to remember that in all of the decisions that we make, we need to keep our eyes on God, keep our eyes on the shepherd, and not get distracted and wander off and do things that are apart from God, but instead keep an eye on God and always follow where He's taking us so that we never become lost. All right. Well, that's our lesson for today, for this week for Sunday school. We have one more week to go with the parable of the lost sheep, so we'll do that next week. In the meantime, you have an activity video coming up. It's arts and crafts with Mrs. Bast. So we hope that you will enjoy that video and tune into it and maybe make something a little bit creative to remind you of the parable of the lost sheep. All right. That's it for today. Bye.